As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. Like it or not, our family histories define us. But what if there are gaps in your history that you know are blocking you from fully living? What lengths would you go to identify these blocks, understand them, and then turn your discoveries into a memoir? Join me and former literary editor of The Nation, Bunting Fellow, and author of the memoir Starry Field, Margaret Juhae Lee, as we explore the impacts of intergenerational trauma and family stories on our identity, the challenges of writing research memoir, staying motivated over the long haul, and the problem of getting an agent too soon on this week's episode of the Writing Your Resilience podcast. Let's dive in. In memoir, every scene should move your story forward, but it can be difficult to figure out which scenes belong, let alone how to frame them when writing about trauma and other tough topics. How do you know which details are essential to your story and which ones will just overwhelm readers? And just as important, how do you write these scenes without triggering yourself? These are common questions that can be so tough to answer. That's why I'm teaming up with Jane Friedman on October 16th to teach Mastering Trauma Scenes to Improve Your Memoir. During this webinar, you'll learn the difference between trauma, crisis, and rising action, how a scene's position in your manuscript will determine which details matter, and how to slant your material so that it propels your story forward. You'll leave with a deeper understanding of your story, confidence in your ability to add tough scenes to your memoir, and tools that will help you care for your readers and yourself. Best of all, this webinar is only $25. That's right, $25. For that price, you'll get access to the webinar, a workbook filled with tips and tricks, a copy of the recording, and a copy of the comprehensive Q&A. So if you want to craft a story that hooks readers and keeps them glued to your memoir, join me on October 16th for Mastering Trauma Scenes to Improve Your Memoir. The link is in the show notes. Well, hello, Margaret. I am just beyond delighted to have you on the podcast. It's so good to see you again.
Good to see you too, Lisa. It's been a while. It's been a couple years. So
I know it has. And I'm holding up your book and I'm doing a huge happy dance because we've been walking this journey for a long time here.
Yes.
And I only participated in a small part of that journey because this book journey has been going on for quite a while.
Yeah, it's almost 25 years has been. I think I started research in 1998 and it was published in 2024. So actually more than 25. I'm really bad at math. So more
that
than
just
25
means you're a
years.
writer.
My husband likes to joke that it's my first child. I have other children who are 18 and 15, but this book has been around before my husband. So it's nice to see it in the world.
Absolutely. And I can totally understand why he would say that, why you might think that, because I've read it, which everyone really should read this book. I have some thoughts about what I love about it, but I want to start by giving you an opportunity to let us know what you would like us to know about Starry Field.
I think I want to start with the title. I think people always ask, what is Starry Field? And Starry Field is a translation of my grandfather Lee Chul Ha's pen name, which is Sungya in Korean. And that's the name we discovered that he used with his communist comrades in the late 1920s in Korea when Korea was a colony of Japan. And when we discovered that name, I knew it had to be the title of the book. It's so poetic, and I think it really expresses his idealism to have Korea as an independent country and, looking towards the stars. And yeah, I knew it was going to be the title from the beginning.
Yeah, it is a perfect title. And can you tell us about the cover? Because There's
Oh,
something
yes, yes. Yeah,
significant
yeah, yeah,
there.
yeah. So the cover is my grandfather's actual prison photograph. It was taken when he was 19 years old in Seoul, when he was arrested by the ruling Japanese for protesting their rule.
Mhm.
He was actually handing out leaflets to high school students, urging them to boycott classes because they refused to teach Korean history or even Korean language in the
Mhm.
schools. Um, and that just that act has so many reverberations now with the protests, and it's just amazing to think of this teenage, boy who was my grandfather doing that and then being in prison for 7 years.
Yeah. I was just amazed by his courage, by his fortitude, by his passion, by all of the things he did, and your other family members as well. I mean, he is definitely a hero in this book, but he's not the
Right.
only one.
No, no, no.
And I think that's one of the things that I really loved about this book. So, as a person who grew up in the United States with an American education, we learn so little about Korea. It
Mhm.
and your book educated me on so many things in addition to helping me fall in love with your family and then also with your story. I mean, I was already in love with you because I've known you for a while, but then getting to know you in this deeper, more intimate way through your memoir was just a privilege. And especially your grandmother, Halmoni, I
Mhm.
loved getting to know her. And I was just thinking about the strength she had to have to
Mhm.
endure all of the things from the colonial rule of the Japanese and then the Korean War and raising 2 boys through all of this and then having a husband who was seen as a traitor. Oh my gosh, the courage she had to show.
Right, right. And, the book is really centered on her stories
Mhm.
that she told me. So I conducted 3 pretty long form oral history sessions with her when she was 90 years old, which happened to be 6 months before she passed away. And she told me stories she had never shared before with
Mhm.
anyone because she was a survivor. She had to be.
Yeah.
She was always looking forward. She was never looking back. And when I started asking her questions, the first thing she said, I mean, she totally like gave me the stink eye. And the first question she asked was like, why do you want to know about painful things? Like
Yes.
she didn't understand why, why would anyone wanna know? Because she had already put that in the past.
Mhm.
And it was a real struggle for me to have her talk to me. And, I said, "Well, I need it, to explore my identity, emotional reasons, blah, 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 blah," and she did not wanna talk.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I said, "Grandma or how many this is for my career. I'm a journalist. I'm trying to get a book published." And then she's like, "Okay, I'll do it because it's for your career and you need to eat." So she's a super practical woman, and that's what got through to her, which is so funny. But once she started talking about her life, she couldn't stop.
Mm.
She just kept going and going and going because it just flowed out because it'd been inside for so long.
Yeah. You gave her such a huge gift. And I wonder how much of her reticence to speak was
Mhm.
related to culture, her own coping mechanisms. And,
Mhm.
you know, I don't know generationally what it was like in Korea, but I know, in the United States, we might talk about someone being part of the silent generation
Right.
and, how much that generational experience might have affected that. Do you have any insights?
I think it's definitely generational. I think many people, including my parents who lived through the Korean War, they were in high school. I mean, when I grew up, they never talked about the war. It
Mhm.
was too painful, and I think
Sure.
it's almost up to the next generation to ask questions about that
Yes.
experience. And when I was growing up, my parents said, "Oh, well, I graduated college late because there was a war for 3 years and I couldn't go to school." So that was the framing of the Korean
Mm.
War, not that, my family was displaced, people died, like things they
Right.
saw, horrible things. It was just something they had to put behind them, and especially as first generation immigrants in this country, they're just trying to survive. They don't have the privilege or the time to look backwards. And I think that's common to many immigrant groups.
Absolutely. And yeah, that's such a nonchalant thing to say. Oh, well,
Mhm.
I couldn't go to school for this period of time. Just a war, not a
Right.
big deal. And
Right.
and that's a thing that Americans can't fathom in the same way,
Mhm.
just because other than 9/11 or Pearl Harbor, we have not really been attacked in this
Right.
country. We do not understand war in the same way
No.
your family understands war.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. And, I felt that, I think, trauma in a way. And,
Yeah.
when I started this book, the term intergenerational trauma was not one that was
Mhm.
used. And so I didn't think of my story in those terms. But once I heard that, I'm like, oh, that's part of what's going on here. There's trauma that is inherited and is at the heart of my family's experience.
Yes.
Even though they never talked about it, I could feel it. And I think that's what I was working through in this book, even though I didn't frame it in that way when I started because it
Mhm.
wasn't part of the lexicon. PTSD was not part of the lexicon really in the late
Yeah.
90s. It was only used in reference to veterans usually.
Mhm.
And now it's used by everyone. It's like, "Oh, I have PTSD from this." Oh, it's just thrown around in our speech.
Yeah, and the unfortunate thing about that is when we use these words so cavalierly and so casually, they lose their
Mhm.
meaning, but
Yes.
your family definitely experienced severe trauma as a result of war, and yeah, I can see how that PTSD and the experience gets passed down often through the silence.
Right. Oh, definitely. And, that was part of my inheritance. I didn't have family stories growing up, maybe some from childhood, but not the core of what my parents grew up with, and then my grandparents. So my grandfather was just
Mhm.
this empty hole, and that gets passed down as
Yeah.
this emptiness. And it took me a while to realize the real reason I was writing this book, but it wasn't until I had children that
Mm.
I discovered, like, I was writing it for them so they could have the
Mhm.
family stories that I didn't or my parents didn't. And now I know, reading, psychological studies and things that how important family stories are to
Yes.
identity formation. And I think that's one reason why I felt so lost for so many
Mhm.
years until I was an adult. I didn't go on the search for identity, for my Korean identity until I was an adult. Like you, I grew up knowing very little about Korean history. Of
Mhm.
course, it wasn't taught in school.
Right.
I grew up in Texas, no one even talked about the Japanese internment camps. Like that wasn't taught in
Right.
school. And when I went to college at the University of Texas in the 80s, there was no Asian American Studies program. So
Mhm.
I didn't even identify as Asian American until I moved to California. There were so few Asian people of Asian descent when I grew up. There was only one other Korean family,
Mhm.
one Chinese family. It was 98% white. So I didn't feel that identity, that community until I moved to the West Coast. Um,
Yeah, and this is coming from your book.
mhm.
It seemed like growing up, you were almost fighting for a specific identity. Like, no, I'm an American
Right.
because you were
Right.
experiencing so many people questioning your identity and asking, well, where are you from? Really?
Right, right, right. And that was a daily occurrence. I just did a reading in Austin. I went to UT Austin, so it's kind of a homecoming. And I was staying with a childhood friend of mine. And he asked me, he's like, "Oh, what could we have done to make you feel more at home?" And I'm like, "Well, you guys are my friends. So,
Hmm.
with you guys, I never felt like I was a foreigner. But on a daily basis, my family and I were treated like foreigners,
Yeah.
from neighbors or assumptions like, "Oh, are you guys Vietnamese boat people?" Or, there were all these assumptions by just looking at our faces. And it was never that we were American or that I was born in this country. That was never the assumption
Yeah.
growing up.
I'm really mindful when I'm in hotels. especially because this is usually where I ask this question. I'll be in some elevator with someone and I'll ask
Mhm.
someone, "Oh, where are you from?" Or I've learned to say, "Where are you traveling from?" Because
Mhm.
especially if I'm, you know, in an elevator with someone who maybe did come from another country or probably has had the same experience that you've had,
Right.
I really try to be mindful to not other them in that way because I
Yes,
think it's
yes.
such an unconscious thing that happens and we don't even realize it.
Right, right. It's such a loaded question for me. It's like, "Oh, I'm from Oakland," or "I'm from Houston," or but that's not what well, I mean, now I think it's a little bit different, but back then,
Mhm.
that's not what they were asking. They were not asking the question that they wanted the answer to. They could have said, "What is your cultural heritage?" Rather than just assuming where you from means you're from a foreign country. So,
Exactly.
yeah, yeah, super loaded question. So almost every Asian American person I know hates that question. Or, any other person from a different country, immigrants. Yeah.
Yeah, it's because it's not they aren't asking you a direct question that's
No.
related to their real curiosity, which is an
Mhm.
inappropriate curiosity. I mean, unless
Right.
you have some reason for needing to know that and you're having a thoughtful conversation, which
Mhm.
most of these questions are not coming from that space.
No, not at all.
It's just trying to figure out, well, where do you fit within my paradigm of how
Right.
I see the world? And that's not useful.
No, no, and it was interesting when I lived in Minneapolis, I lived there for a year, I would get questions like, "Oh, are you adopted?" Because most of the Asian people that, these white people had come across in Minneapolis were adoptees from Korea or Japan.
Mhm.
So I got that a lot. I'm like, that's not really a nice question to ask someone that you never
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, yeah, it's like, what kind of assumption is that? Yeah, so it's just interesting. And it doesn't I mean, maybe it's because I'm in the Bay Area, like, I don't get those questions
Mhm.
anymore. Um,
Well, good.
yeah.
Yeah, because
I mean, yeah, maybe it's, progress or maybe it's just where I am. So, yeah.
I'm gonna hope for progress
Yes.
for all of us because, if you're listening and this is something you found yourself doing, you're like, "Oh my gosh, I think I've done this in the past."
Mm,
Here's a great opportunity to think about this in a different way and change your behavior,
mhm,
right? You can just
yeah,
do something different and interact with people in a different way and really be mindful that these questions are not helpful. And in fact, they can be very hurtful
mm,
to people because it makes people feel separate.
right, right, definitely.
So, getting back to this book, which took you 25 years, that's like an adult child. I mean,
Yeah.
you raised this child, launched this child quite literally.
Right,
Um,
right, right,
and I know that one of the questions everyone's going to have is how did you maintain your focus and your motivation
right.
and your tenacity over that length of time?
I mean, there are definitely, chunks of years where I had to put it away,
Yeah.
mostly for caretaking reasons when my children were little. And, there were many instances where I thought I was going to quit. Because when I started this book, I was a journalist in New York. I was working at the Nation magazine. I got a fellowship, very prestigious fellowship at Harvard, and I got an agent right away in the late 90s. And I got an agent way too soon
Mm.
before I really knew what this book was about. I thought this book was a book of journalism because that's what I was and that's what I knew how to write.
Hmm.
And when I sat down after I went to Korea to look for my grandfather's records and interview my grandmother, I came back to the US and I sat down and tried to write it. And I realized that journalism wasn't going to capture the entire story.
Hmm.
And also, as a journalist, I wasn't comfortable writing about myself because that's not what they teach you in journalism school. So that was a big, big struggle for me. And I worked with my agent, and then he left the business. And I think that was a blessing. At the time, I
Hmm.
was kind of devastated because I thought, like, oh, this is the next part of my career. I'm going to get a book deal, and then I don't have to. But I think it gave me the time to gain the skills to write the book that I wanted to write. And it took a while. I really read fiction. I read a lot of fiction in a very critical way. I looked at scenes, I looked at dialogue. Then I met my husband and I started having kids and I put it away for a while. And then when I came back to the book, when they started going to preschool, I started taking generative writing
Mhm.
workshops because I was stuck and I didn't know how to approach all this research I'd done, all these interviews I had conducted with my grandmother and also my great uncles, and I had all this stuff and I didn't know how to to figure out how to get it on the page. And this generative writing workshop was the best thing for me because I'm an editor. I self-edit way too much, and I was forced to write in longhand in a community, feeling very held and safe, and what came out was my book. I didn't have my notes, I didn't have any of the research, but the research had permeated and I could
Yes.
figure out the story. So that's the kind of short version of part of the journey. I did have to put it down again. I had a pretty good draft. I had sent it to an agent. She said, "I'm very interested. I think there's some issues here." And she's totally right. And then I was working on a new draft, and then my parents, both of them,
Uh-huh.
became ill. And so I was also during caretaking.
Yeah, and so what I want people to hear is it's not like you worked on this the entire time.
No,
You
no,
worked
not
on
at
it, you
all.
took breaks, you worked on it. You had so much research, and that is clear
Yes.
in this book because we see photographs of different things.
Mhm.
And what I love about this is that you were in this generative writing group where you
Mhm.
had to let that go. And I often tell
Yes.
people when they have lots of research, I don't know if this is your experience, but a lot of the clients and students I work with, they get very attached to the research because you had to
Yes.
work hard. And so
Yes.
you want to put everything in the
Yeah.
book and
Yeah.
that's not useful. And I'm going to open this just to get the page numbers. Yeah, this is a nice lean book, especially given how much research is in it. I mean, it's 265 pages going to
Right.
the epilogue. And so you had to do a lot of weeding, a lot of culling. You had to figure
Mhm.
out how to tell the story, knowing that it's all inside you. And we're going
Right.
to talk about the structure in a moment, but you said something that caught my ear, and I know it's going to catch everyone else's ear. You said, I got an agent too soon. And
Yeah.
that's only something that you learned in retrospect. What would you like
Right.
people to know about that process and what you learned?
I learned that, I felt very validated when I got an agent, and I actually had a couple of agents interested in what I was working on, but it wasn't, I didn't have enough written, I didn't have a conception of the
Mhm.
book, and if I had published a book in 2000, 2002, it wouldn't be the book that I don't think I would have been happy with it,
Yeah.
inside. And if I had gotten a contract, I would have been required to
Hmm.
finish by a certain time. And I know myself, like I'm a journalist, I always follow the deadline and I would have given them something. I think maybe a novelist would take longer and think like, oh, creatively, I don't know if this is right. And, there are plenty of people who get contracts and never finish their book.
Hmm.
But I'm glad I wasn't in that scenario because I think I would have felt really guilty if I'd gotten that far. I mean, but it was really, really hard. I was kind
Yeah.
of devastated and I really had to shift gears and had to get a real job and do journalism and whatever. I patched together paying jobs, but yeah, yeah, it was really hard, but it was a blessing, 20 years later. Because this
Yeah.
is my family story. I don't want to mess it up. I mean, I knew that deep inside. Yeah.
I'm glad you just said that because so many people get impatient. They want to
Mhm.
hurry up and get it out because they think somehow it's going to lead to whatever the next great thing is. And
Right,
maybe it
right,
will, maybe it
right,
won't.
right.
But one thing that can definitely happen is that if you haven't taken time to really process and understand your story and tell it in the best possible way, there are no redos.
Right, right, right.
You get
Yeah,
one
I know.
shot with these.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was a journey, but I think I feel good about it, and I think it honors my family, and I'm happy to have my kids read it, and so that's a victory. So, yeah, and it also helps to be incredibly stubborn. So
Yes. Stubbornness is a huge asset when you're a writer.
Right, right.
And I'm so glad that you were stubborn because this book is amazing. And as I was, reading this and following your research journey, because that is part of what we
Mhm,
do is follow some of
mhm.
that research journey. I was just thinking, how did you do this so elegantly? Because we were together in 2019 at the Writers Hotel conference, and I
Right.
got to read a portion that I believe at that time was called The Beginning.
Right,
And
right.
as I was reading, I'm like, wait a second. I see these pages. This is the middle of the book.
Right,
So
right, right.
when you were in your later stage of the writing process,
Mhm.
how did you go about structuring this book, and how did you know this structure was the right one?
Structure was the biggest challenge in this book. I have 3 main characters, me, my grandmother, and my father, and in the background, my grandfather, even though he's not quite a character because only like a handful of people knew him. It spans 100 years. There's, you know, it's a very, very complicated story, and I knew I couldn't present it in a traditional narrative form because it didn't
Mhm.
work. So I didn't come up with the structure until I finished my book proposal. And there are a lot of index cards, using whiteboards, and I knew that my grandmother's oral histories, which pertain to certain points of her life, were the pillars. And I think it was my agent really asking me questions and
Mhm.
really distilling what was really important. And it was my grandmother's story because that's the conduit to the past. She was my conduit to the past. And I organized the book with these different parts of my grandmother's life, and also that, my childhood, my father's childhood, and then the middle part, her marriage, and then at the end, like when she had children. So there was a lot of shuffling.
Yes.
It was like putting a jigsaw puzzle together, literally. Yeah.
I definitely felt that, and yet it felt like a complete puzzle.
Yeah, yeah, I think it finally fell into place when I could state what the structure was.
Mhm.
Because before, I think it kinda worked and it flowed, but it wasn't quite right, and I really credit my agent for being an amazing editor and helping me with that.
Yeah, I bow to her because I know how much she helped you with this in terms of
Right.
thinking through these things,
Yes.
and that's important because a lot of people don't realize structure is a team sport so
Yes,
often
yes.
because it can be so complicated, especially when you have researched work that you're trying to infuse and or you have a
Mhm.
complicated story. Like yours is spanning 100 years.
Right.
And, I know some people, they're trying to just write about their life, and they're
Mhm.
not, it's not about other people's lives. And they've got 50, 75 years they're trying to write about. And knowing
Right.
how to skip, move around, create something that feels like a cohesive arc is
Mhm.
really important because we really do have two arcs that I see that are really important. Your grandmother's arc and
Mhm.
her arc of transformation and being able to tell this story,
Right,
and how she
right.
sees this and then your arc and then your father's arc as well
Right, right.
because he didn't know anything about his father.
Right, right. And the discovery of my grandmother's stories, and also that my grandfather was a leader in the movement, like it totally changed him. He became a
Yeah.
different person once he knew, because he always carried the shame of being the son of a criminal.
Mhm.
Like when on my parents' first date, that was one of the first things he said to my mom. He's like, I'm the son of a criminal. And my mother would tell me the story. She's like, I thought your dad was kind of kidding. So I just kind of ignored that and just went on with the
Yeah.
conversation. But it's just like, I was thinking about like my poor dad, like he feels like he has to confess to this woman who would be my mom right up front. So she would know that, hey, I'm tainted goods. Yeah. Yeah. But once he found out, it was like a weight lifted off him. He became gregarious, he became huggy, he was not the father I grew up with. Like, he became maybe his true self, you
Mhm.
know?
That's, to me, that's the miracle of this process. And it's not so much
Yeah.
about, the finished product, which I
Right.
know your dad would be so proud of you. He is so proud of you. I believe that 100%. And just the fact that you are going through this process and you were going through it with him and he was
Mhm.
hearing all of the stuff transformed him.
Right, right, right. And that was, maybe the one of the biggest gifts for me is to really get to know who my father was and understand him. Because when I
Mhm.
was growing up, he was very quiet, very stern, did not show his emotion. And my mother, who was a painter, was always translating my father to me and my
Mhm.
brother. It's like, well, your father's very happy about this and this. And we're like, okay, like because he didn't feel comfortable expressing himself. And, once this revelation happened, he realized, like, oh, this is where I come from.
Mm.
Because my grandfather was an intellectual. He was reading Marx, he was reading, Lenin, he was reading novels by Thomas Hardy. That's something I found out was the reading list of every book he read in prison because the
Yeah.
Japanese were amazing record keepers. And my father always felt like the weirdo in his family. He was the first one to go to college. He was the egghead. He wasn't like his brother or his cousins. And he always felt very different. And I think learning who his father was is like, oh, that's where I get, my interest in sociology and math and all these different things from.
Yeah, because he was following in his father's footsteps. He just didn't
Yes.
know it.
He didn't know it. Yeah.
And at
Yeah.
that time, you said he was reading Thomas Hardy. Was he reading a Korean or Japanese translation, or was he reading an English version? Because I know that they were required to learn Japanese, but
Right,
were
right,
they
right.
learning English at that time, or was this just some remarkable thing that he did?
I'm guessing it was in Japanese. I don't really know. I don't know if my grandfather learned English. I think
Mhm.
these were translations into Japanese or Korean, most likely Japanese. But yeah, I mean, he was interested in Thomas, maybe he just read it
Mm.
because it was there, but,
Still,
but
he
it's
read
just, it's
it.
just like, it was there at the prison, it just seems so odd, at the most notorious prison in Seoul reserved for political prisoners. They had books by, Thomas Hardy, and they had science books and yeah, math books and all kinds of things. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that is really remarkable
Yeah.
because you wouldn't think that that would be there
Right.
because I would almost imagine if I were in charge of the prison, I would want them to have less information,
Right. Right.
less
Right.
capacity to
Yeah.
think about all the things that they might want to do. And
Yeah.
yet, what a gift that he
Yeah.
had access
Yeah.
to all of that and he was able to
Right.
take all of that in.
Yeah. 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 It's pretty amazing.
So structure was one of the things you had to deal with, and then
Mhm.
you talked about being a journalist and the challenges of that. And I have
Mhm.
worked with many what I call journalists in recovery because
Yes.
they
Yes.
want to write memoir or they want to write things that are more narrative where they
Right.
have to be the character.
Mhm.
And you have this wonderful background that helped you with all the research. When you started writing your story in particular,
Mhm.
what of your journalistic background did you keep, and what did you have to scrap in order to
Mm.
truly write your story in a narrative way that was going to hook the reader and keep them hooked?
I think that journalism really helped with gathering details
Mhm.
about scenes and being the observer, because the journalist is the observer. Usually you're writing in the third person so I think that really helped in capturing the milieu wherever I was and having the resources to know how to research that too.
Mhm.
I can go to I mean, now everything's online. When I started, I had to go to the libraries. It's
Yeah.
a different approach, but I knew how to find the information as
Mhm.
well. What I had to unlearn is that observational point of view.
Yeah.
I had to be the motor, and that was so difficult because I am way more comfortable writing about other people. And, I had to unlearn those strict edicts that they teach you in journalism, no I in
Mhm.
journalism. And I think I mentioned this before, it's like really look to fiction,
Yes.
and not be so concerned about, is everything I say true?
Mhm.
Because there's different points of view. This is what my grandmother said. I don't know if all of it's true, but it's
Mhm.
what she said or it's her version of the truth. I have other interviews with great uncles, one who is notoriously not a good source. And my
Mhm.
father said, it's like, I don't believe anything he says. So, but I was interested in what he said because part of it rang true to me. And also the freedom in memoir to say, like, this could have happened. This is what someone says, and not being overly concerned with what is the truth in the big T kind of way. And I think that was very freeing for me Because memoir writing is not just truth writing or what is perceived as. It's not journalism, like you must get all the facts right. You must, you do have to get the facts right, but you have the freedom to say, this might have happened or this might have happened,
Hmm.
and give the reader the choice. Like, what do you think? So that was a big breakthrough for me, is to put in the text, like, you know what? This person's not the most reliable person, but this is what they said. Um,
Yeah, I love that you gave yourself the permission to do that and to let go of some of the things that you were trained that were
mhm.
hardwired inside you because memoir is about emotional truth.
Right.
Sue William Silverman was one of my guests,
Mm,
and one of the things that she talks about in her new book is that we don't want to Xerox our stories, right? It's not a
right.
Xeroxing of the life events that happened. It
Yes.
is an ordering and a curating so that we can get to an emotional truth, which
Mhm.
may or may not be different from the actual hard facts because we're
Right.
looking at recollection and point of views and all of these things that you shared so beautifully. So, writers, you need to listen to everything that Margaret says. And then you need to go buy her book to see how she was able to pull that off. Because I really felt connected to you. And I was thinking about, okay, I know you.
Mhm.
We've had lots of interactions over the years. How much of that sense of connection and closeness is related to me knowing you personally, or
Mhm.
how much of it is the story? And I definitely feel like the way you wrote this, the vulnerability, the openness, the way that you navigate your scenes, and just even talking about your, young life and the
Mm,
bands that you
mhm.
liked and, the
Right.
raves you were at, all of these
Right.
things made me trust you and also
Mm.
gave me a sense of who you were and who you are. And
Right.
so
Right.
I was really grateful to the book for that. So you've been on book tour for a while now.
Right. Right.
People have been asking you lots of questions. What's a question that nobody has asked as of yet? Or one that you're like, you know what, please ask me this. I want to answer it.
Oh, you know what? I thought people were gonna ask about my New York boyfriend in the book, which I really struggled writing about another person that I'm not in contact now,
Mm.
because I thought it was so essential to the story, but that is not, no one's asked about him at all. So it's interesting to me. Like, I was like, "Oh, okay, maybe that wasn't as important as I thought it was." Because what sent me on this journey was that I was searching for, I had just broken up with this boyfriend who had some severe mental health struggles and didn't want to deal with them. And, that was kind of the space where I was when I started this journey. And I had part of the arc of the book is that I have always wanted kids from the
Mhm.
beginning, in my 20s, and it was always this urge. And I had horrible, horrible taste in men. And I did not know how to figure out a way, that I could have kids. And I didn't
Mhm.
end up having kids until I was in my 40s. So I waited a long time. Also, I was moving around a lot. I didn't feel
Yeah.
like I was at home anywhere. There was always that urge. And I think I realized is that I needed to clear the way for myself to
Mhm.
to search for my identity, to figure out what happened in the past before I started a family of my own.
Yeah, so that intuition drove you as well as those
Mhm.
spidey senses like, "This is not the one."
Right, right, right.
Yeah, and I mean, you write as you were talking about this boyfriend, I'm like, "Oh, yes, I know exactly who you're talking about in the
Mhm.
stories." Written in a very colorful way. I mean, you bring him to life so well, but as you're talking about it now and as I was thinking about it as I was reading, I think about that Vivian Gornick statement out
Mm.
situation versus story.
Right, right,
He
right,
was
right.
part of the situation, right? He was
Right,
like,
right.
the background that needed to happen in order for
Yes.
the true story to
Oh,
take
totally.
place.
Yeah, yeah. And that book was so, so influential on me because I was stuck in the situation. All my
Yeah.
research, all the facts, all this, I need to explain this, I need to explain Korean history, all this stuff. And, getting to the story was
Mhm.
the hard part for me because I had too much stuff and I
Yeah.
needed to be free from that. And I think having time away and not being immersed, and then I could figure out the story. I needed that break, I think.
Yeah, was there something that created the big breakthrough for you? So, like, we're moving into the towards the end.
Mhm.
We could I mean, I miss you, Margaret. Can I just say that? I miss you. We haven't seen each other in a
Oh,
little
I
while because 'cause you've been
know,
on
I
book
know.
tour. So, we're gonna catch up later at another
Yes.
time, but I think this is a nice segue thinking about the best writing advice you have or a breakthrough that you had
Mm,
because you had to go from situation to story. And I'm
mhm.
wondering if anyone said anything or there's just something happened that created that breakthrough for you.
I think just writing off the top of my head was the best way
Mhm.
for me to figure out the story. Like, having a prompt, I think the first prompt that really spoke to me is, like, think of a photograph that is really important to you and write to that
Yeah.
photograph, and the photograph is the picture of my grandfather, his prison
Mhm.
picture, which is on the cover, and that was the only photograph we had of him. So, I wrote to that photograph, and that came, you know, without, going into like, "Oh, this is from 1929," and giving the
Mhm.
facts about it and what that photograph meant to me.
Yeah.
Here is this young boy who's 19 who looks a lot like my brother, who was about the same age when we found that photograph, and kind of going towards that because that's the artifact we had of this man that no one ever knew.
Yeah, the resemblance is uncanny.
Yes, yes, it's pretty amazing. Yeah.
And I know this because you include so many photos of your family
Right,
in the book,
right,
which was truly a gift. I'm curious if, one of the things that happened as you were working on this book is unfortunately both your parents passed away.
right.
And I was speaking with another writer about what happens when we step away from our manuscripts because of grief. I know a
Mhm.
lot of people who have to do that because they don't have the energetic space for both.
Right,
When
right,
you came back to this manuscript and you are this new person because of the
right.
experience you had, was there anything about that that allowed you to see this story in a different way?
I I wrote the prologue and epilogue after my parents passed away,
Mhm.
and it is about grief.
Yeah.
I took my family to Korea. We scattered my parents' ashes there, and I think those were the perfect bookends to this book because most of it is set in 2000, which is 25 years ago. So I think having that bookend works and bringing the present into the past, my present self as a mother of two kids, as a settled person who has a home in Oakland and, husband and family.
Yeah, and your kids are great in the book. And I
Yeah.
and I love I agree with you 100% that prologue and epilogue, it's a perfect way to work through this and to set us
Mhm.
up for it. So, you've been on book tour for a while, few months now, because the
Mhm.
book came out in March, correct?
March, right, right,
Yes.
right.
So, how have you been nurturing your resilience in what is often a really grueling time for people?
Right. I have really focused on going to places where I have friends. So I
Mm.
was just in Austin. I spoke at the Writers League of Texas Agents and Editors Conference, which is a great conference. But I went to school at UT Austin. I stayed with my childhood friend. I did a reading. And, I had all these old friends I haven't seen in 30 years come. And that's how I nurture it. And also I met new writers and even though it's exhausting, I try to look at these events like how is it going to help me rather
Mhm.
than like I have to sell books. Yeah. Yeah. So I've gone places like I went to New York where I used to live. I've been to Portland where my brother lives, Seattle where I have a lot of writer friends,
Yeah.
and I'm really trying to use the book tour and speaking engagements as a way to connect with people. And in Austin, I was so surprised. Like my one of my parents' oldest friends from Houston
Oh.
drove up with his son. They drove 2.5 hours to Austin, surprised me. He's like, "Do you remember me?" I'm like, "Oh yes, Mr. Puck." So that
Oh.
just really touched me. And then in Amherst, I saw a family. I'm like, "Oh, look, there's a Korean family." There aren't that many Koreans in Amherst. I'm like,
Mhm.
"Oh," and it turned out to be my cousin, Robert,
Oh.
like, who I haven't talked to in over 20 years. I'm like, "Robert?" And they drove all the way from upstate New York, just so those have been just some amazing, amazing moments.
I think that's really smart and also very beautiful. And so, what I'm hearing in this is that number one, you recognize that book tour and all the things you have to do in your launch
Mhm.
year are draining your cup, right? They do that
Yes,
to
yes,
everyone. And
yes.
yet, you're being really intentional about as you go out, how can I fill my cup by
Mhm.
connecting with people and, either creating new meaningful relationships or,
Right.
rekindling ones. And so that is an incredible thing to be able to do. And then
Mhm.
not thinking about the book sales
Right,
because I
right.
think it's so easy for people to get disappointed and
Yes,
when it's about the numbers because the numbers are
yes.
never going to be what you hope they are. I mean,
No.
I think even if they are, we just up the ante and say, okay, well, it's here. Now it needs to be there.
Right, right, right. And, book sales, like, I still don't know how many books I've sold. And my agent's like, well, you'll know in your royalty statement. So I get two royalty statements. So we'll see. But yeah, I'm trying to focus it on myself and what I want to get out
Mhm.
of this book. I really want to speak at colleges because I would love for this book to be taught in Asian American studies
Yes.
classes because this is the book I would have wanted to read as a young person. And because it's for my children and they're teenagers, that's the generation I really want to reach for the future.
I'm super excited about that for you. I can't wait to hear in the near future that this is actually happening.
Yeah.
And so there's so much we could talk about with this book. And what I'm going to just end with is buy the book and also review the book
Oh,
because
yes, please.
Margaret has worked so hard and all of those reviews are really helpful to the author. So don't forget to do that. If people want to buy Starry Field, I'm going to hold it up again for those
Okay.
people looking on or watching on YouTube. What are the best ways to buy your book and also to connect with you?
I have a website, www.margaretjuhaelee.com. I'm also on Instagram at mjuhae. Please buy your book at your local independent bookseller or bookshop.org, or you can buy it wherever you want, but I won't mention those places. Feel free to review. That is very, very helpful, are the reviews online. Yes, but yes, you can reach me. I'm on Insta a lot. That's something I've learned is how to be my own social media manager, and I got many lessons from my teenage children. So, thankful. I'm thankful to them.
Kudos to your teenage children because yes, we like all of us, we need these tutorials and they seem to
Right.
know all of it.
Yes. Yes.
Well, Margaret, it's been an absolute pleasure both to read your book, to see you today, and to celebrate this momentous occasion of your book launch year and all that you're doing. I am so grateful to you, and I'm grateful to this book, which I think everyone should read. So I'm going to do one more shout out as you're buying and as you're reviewing. Order it from your library so the person who needs to read
Mm,
it but may not have the funds has access.
yes. Thank you so much, Lisa. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for listening. To learn more about Margaret's publications and accomplishments, and more importantly, to buy a copy of her memoir, Starry Field, please see the show notes. If you're learning from or enjoying this podcast, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's a free and easy way to support the podcast. You can also get the latest episodes delivered to your inbox by signing up for my Writing Your Resilience newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of A Trauma Survivor's Guide to Writing the Tough Stuff. You can also follow the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, where you can leave a 5-star review. If you have questions for me, comments about the podcast, or questions or topics you'd like me to consider for the Writing Your Resilience podcast, please leave a comment on YouTube. I read them all, and I'd love to hear from you.